My stepmother threw a graduation party for my stepsister the same weekend I got my college acceptance letter, and not a single person in that house said congratulations to me. That's not even the part that broke me. The part that broke me came 3 days later, when I found out she had used my financial aid application, my personal information, my social security number, my everything, to redirect my scholarship funds into an account I'd never heard of. $34,000, gone before I ever saw it. I was 22 years old, standing in the financial aid office of a university I could no longer afford to attend, holding a printout that made no sense, asking the woman behind a desk to explain to me how this was possible. She was patient. She pulled up the records slowly, turned the monitor toward me, and pointed to an address I didn't recognize and a bank routing number that wasn't mine. Someone had called in, she said. Claimed to be my guardian. Updated the disbursement information 6 weeks before the funds were released. I knew exactly who had made that call. I want to explain something about my stepmother before I go any further, because the easy version of the story makes her a cartoon villain, and the truth is more exhausting than that. She wasn't loud about it. She didn't scream or threaten or leave marks you could photograph. She was the kind of person who smiled at you in public and made you feel like you were imagining things in private. She had been married to my father for 11 years by the time this happened. Long enough that most people who knew our family thought of her as just his wife. Normal. Warm, even. She brought casseroles to church fundraisers. She remembered people's birthdays. She coached my stepsister's soccer team for 2 seasons. What she did inside our house was something else entirely. My mother died when I was 9. It was fast, a diagnosis in February, gone by June. I don't have a lot of memories from that year that aren't underwater and blurred, but I remember the silence in the house afterward. The way my father moved through rooms like he was apologizing to the furniture. I remember being very careful not to need too much. He met her about 18 months later. I was 11. My stepsister was 8. I tried, genuinely tried, the way an 11-year-old tries at things, awkward and earnest and probably annoying. I made her a card when they got engaged. I practiced calling her by her first name so it wouldn't feel weird. I set the table without being asked for 3 weeks straight because I read somewhere that helping with chores made families bond faster. None of it worked, not because I did anything wrong. I understand that now. It just didn't work. She had decided something about me before she ever moved in, and no amount of card making was going to change it. My stepsister got a car for her 16th birthday. I got a card with $20 in it and a comment about how I should start thinking about being more responsible with money. My stepsister got a shopping trip every August for school clothes. I got handed a list of stores that were having sales and told to manage my own budget. My stepsister's grades were celebrated. Mine were acknowledged and then immediately followed by a but. My father saw what he wanted to see. I think that's the most honest way I can put it. He loved her, and loving her meant not looking too hard at certain things. When I tried to talk to him about how I was being treated, he'd listen with this expression on his face. Not dismissive, not angry, just distant, like he was watching me from the wrong end of a telescope. And then he'd say something like, "She's doing her best," or, "You two just need more time." And that would be the end of it. So I learned to be small. I learned to ask for nothing and expect nothing and be grateful for whatever I got. I got good grades because school was the one place nobody could take anything from me. I applied for every scholarship I could find. I filled out the FAFSA at the kitchen table at midnight when everyone else was asleep because I didn't want to answer questions about what I was doing. I built a future in secret because the alternative was having it dismantled. And then she took it anyway. The financial aid office gave me a number to call, a fraud line. The woman behind the desk looked at me with an expression I've since learned to recognize, that particular blend of pity and professional neutrality, and she said very carefully that what I was describing sounded like identity theft and that I should contact law enforcement as well as the university's legal office. I walked out of that building and sat on a bench outside for a long time. It was late October, cold enough that I could see my breath. I had my phone in my hand and I didn't call anyone. I didn't know who to call. My father was at work. My best friend was in class. I had $47 in my checking account and a lease on an apartment that started in January, and no way to pay for any of it anymore. I called my father from that bench. He picked up on the third ring. I told him what I'd found out. I kept my voice flat because I was afraid of what would happen if I didn't. I read him the details from the printout, the account number, the address, the date of the call. There was a long silence on his end. And then he said, "Are you sure you didn't make a mistake somewhere in the application?" I hung up. I sat there for another 20 minutes. A man walking a dog passed me twice. The second time, he glanced at me with a look that said he could tell something was wrong, but he kept walking and I didn't blame him. I called a rideshare because I didn't trust myself to drive. When the car arrived, the driver, a woman maybe 60 years old, gray-haired, reading glasses pushed up on her head, asked me if I was okay. I said I was fine. She looked at me in the rearview mirror and said, "You don't have to be fine." And something about that cracked me open in a way I wasn't expecting. I started crying before we'd made it 2 blocks. She didn't say anything for a minute, then she said, "Do you have somewhere safe to go right now?" I said I thought so. My apartment, mine, not my father's house, was safe. I had a roommate who was kind. I had a door that locked. She nodded. She drove, and then, about 4 blocks from my building, she said, "I'm going to give you something, and I need you to not throw it away." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just looked at her in the mirror. She pulled over, put on the hazards, shifted into park, and reached into the center console. She pulled out a business card and reached it back to me between the seats. It was worn at the corners, like she'd had it in there for a while. The name on it was an attorney, family law and civil litigation. There was a handwritten note on the back in small, neat writing, "Ask for the pro bono intake. Tell them, Constance sent you." I looked up at her. "Constance?" "That's me," she smiled. Not a big smile, just enough. "My daughter went through something similar. Not the same, but similar. That man got her out of it. He's good at what he does." I didn't fully believe her. I want to be honest about that. I took the card because it felt rude not to, and because I was 22 and exhausted and crying in a stranger's car, and I didn't have the bandwidth to evaluate whether this was a real lifeline or just something nice someone was doing to make themselves feel better. I said thank you. I got out of the car. I went upstairs and lay on my bed and stared at the ceiling for 2 hours. At some point, I picked up the card again. I called the number the next morning. The woman who answered was efficient and unsentimental and asked me the right questions in the right order. She scheduled me for an intake appointment 2 days out and told me to bring every document I had: tax returns, the financial aid printout, any written communication with my stepmother, proof of enrollment, identification. She said it like I would definitely have all of these things, which made me feel, oddly, like I was being treated as a competent adult for the first time in recent memory. I spent those 2 days gathering everything I could. I went back to the financial aid office and requested a full paper trail of the changes made to my account. They gave me everything: timestamps, IP addresses, a recording of the phone call in which someone claiming to be my legal guardian had authorized the update. I sat in my car in the parking garage and listened to it on the office's secure portal. It was her voice. Completely calm. Professional? Almost. She'd given my birth date, my social, the last 4 of the account number I'd had on file. She'd done her homework. The attorney's name was Bernard Calloway. He was in his late 50s, quiet in the way that people are quiet when they've heard a lot of very bad things and learned not to show surprise. He listened to everything I said without interrupting. When I finished, he asked 3 questions. Then he sat back and said, "This is wire fraud and identity theft. Possibly elder fraud statutes don't apply here, but the federal wire fraud charge is clean. Are you prepared to pursue this criminally as well as civilly? I said yes before I fully processed the question. He said, good, because I think we should. What followed was 4 months that I can only describe as the slowest possible form of relief. There's nothing fast about legal processes. There's nothing cinematic about it either. It's a lot of waiting for paperwork and a lot of phone calls where someone tells you to wait for more paperwork. I went back to working double shifts at the restaurant where I'd been part-time all through high school. My enrollment got deferred a semester while the university worked with the attorney's office to untangle the financial mess. My roommate, who is a genuinely good human being, didn't raise my rent. My father called twice. The first time, he said he'd talked to my stepmother and she had an explanation. And could we please discuss this as a family before it went any further? I told him there was nothing to discuss, that the recording of her voice existed and was in the hands of an attorney, and that I would not be coming to any family discussions. He was quiet for a moment and then he said, I just don't want this to destroy us. I said, it was already destroyed, I just didn't tell you. The second call came 6 weeks later. He cried. I'd heard my father cry exactly once before at my mother's funeral, and hearing it now felt strange. Not moving, exactly, just strange. He said he should have seen it. He said he was sorry. He said her name like he was testing whether it still meant something to him, and from the way he said it, I could tell it didn't anymore. I didn't forgive him on that phone call. I want to be clear about that. I said I heard him. I said I needed time. I said I would call him when I was ready, and I meant it, and I did eventually call him, but that was later, much later, after everything had settled. The civil case settled in my favor 8 months after I first walked into Bernard's office. I got back the $34,000 plus damages. My stepmother did not go to prison. There was a plea negotiation, reduced charges, probation, mandatory financial restitution, and I won't pretend that felt entirely fair. But Bernard sat across from me and walked me through the calculus of it with the same patient, unsentimental competence he'd had from the beginning, and he said, you have your money, you have your future, and she has a record. That's not nothing. He was right. It wasn't nothing. I started university the following fall, 11 months later than I'd planned. I was 23 in a class of mostly 18-year-olds, and I did not care, even slightly. I sat in the front row of my first lecture, developmental psychology, which felt appropriate, and I thought about Constance pulling over to the curb with her hazards blinking, reaching a worn business card between the seats to a crying girl she didn't know. I tracked her down eventually. It took some doing. I only had the rideshare company's general number, and they don't give out driver information, for obvious reasons, but I left a note with their customer service team asking them to forward a message, and they did. And she called me back one afternoon in November from a number I didn't recognize. She remembered me. She asked how I was doing in a way that made it clear she actually wanted to know. I told her everything. The settlement, the enrollment, the front row of the lecture hall. She made a small sound, not quite a laugh, more like an exhale. Good, she said. That's exactly what should have happened. I asked her why she'd kept that card in her center console. She said her daughter had given her a stack of them years ago and made her promise to hand them out when it felt right. She said I'd know when, Constance told me. She was right. I think about the version of that day where she didn't pull over, where she just drove me home and said something generic and kept the card in the console. I think about how easily that happens, how many small kindnesses don't quite make it out into the world because somebody keeps driving. My father and I talk now. Not often, not easily, but honestly, in a way we never were before. He sold the house and moved into a smaller apartment on the other side of the city. My stepsister and I are cordial. She didn't know, or at least I believe she didn't know, and she reached out with a long, uncomfortable text message about 8 months after everything came out. I haven't fully decided what to do with that relationship, but I haven't closed the door either. I'm in my last semester now. I declared my major in social work, which surprised exactly no one who knows me well. I've started volunteering with a legal aid clinic that serves college students dealing with financial fraud. There are more of them than you'd think. Last week, I sat across from a 20-year-old kid who looked like I must have looked on that bench outside the financial aid office, phone in hand, $47 in his account, not sure who to call. I slid a business card across the table. Not Bernard's, he retired last spring, but his colleague, who is equally good and equally unsentimental, and asks exactly the right questions in the right order. The kid looked at the card and then looked at me. I said, "Don't throw it away." I keep thinking about the woman at the financial aid office. Not Constance, not Bernard, the other one, the one behind the desk who turned the monitor toward me and said, very carefully, that what I was describing sounded like identity theft. She didn't have to do that. She could have handed me a pamphlet and sent me to a hotline. Instead, she looked me in the eye and told me the truth plainly, and that small act of decency set the whole chain in motion. That's the thing about cause and effect that nobody talks about. It doesn't always announce itself. It doesn't come with a label that says this moment matters. It's usually just a woman doing her job a little more honestly than she had to, or a driver pulling over when she didn't need to stop. My stepmother believed she would get away with it because she had gotten away with everything else for 11 years, and she almost did. What she miscalculated was the paper trail, the timestamps, the IP addresses, the recording of her own voice. She was clever enough to execute the fraud, but not careful enough to understand how thoroughly modern financial systems document themselves. That's not poetic justice. That's just what happens when someone acts like the rules don't apply to them and eventually runs into the specific rule that does. What I had to reckon with, sitting across from Bernard in that quiet office, was that I had spent most of my life making myself invisible as a survival strategy. I kept my head down. I didn't ask for things. I filed the FAFSA at midnight so nobody would ask questions, and for a long time I thought that was just who I was. Careful, self-sufficient, not wanting to cause trouble. But the version of me who sat in the front row of that first lecture wasn't the same person who used to set the table 3 weeks straight, hoping someone would notice. Something had shifted. I'd had to learn, in a very concrete and unpleasant way, that being quiet doesn't protect you, that sometimes the only thing that actually protects you is knowing your rights and being willing to use them. That's not cynicism, it's just true. The intelligence part of it, and I mean that in the most practical sense, knowing how systems work, knowing what questions to ask, knowing that a financial aid office has records and that those records can be requested, that was something school gave me. Not any one class, just the general habit of thinking that problems have structures and structures can be understood. I'm grateful for that. I'm also aware that not everyone has equal access to that habit, which is part of why I ended up in social work. The grit part is harder to talk about because it sounds like something you put on a motivational poster. But it wasn't abstract for me. It was $47 and a deferred enrollment and double shifts at a restaurant and 5 months of paperwork. It was calling Bernard's office back after I'd talked myself out of it twice. It was choosing, over and over, to keep going when the easier thing would have been to let it collapse. I slid that card across the table last week and told a 20-year-old not to throw it away. I meant it practically. But I also meant something else, that the people who helped me were ordinary people who made small choices to do the right thing, and that those choices compounded into something that changed the direction of my life. That's what I try to be now, not the main character in someone else's story, just the person who pulls over,